Previously on Thoth and Pals.
Thoth, the poles are shifting.
Oh, the pole shift?
Yeah, whoa, what's wrong with your eyes?
I don't know.
When Thoth first saw signs of the polar shift, they returned to the land of Chem and raised the warship into the sky. They went to Atlantis and picked up the Nacals. The Nacals weren't just passengers though, and each and every being was working in unity to create a very powerful Merkaba around themselves and the ship. They returned to the Great Pyramid and landed the ship on top, forming the phi ratio with the pyramid. And then, it happened. The poles began to shift, and human consciousness began to plummet. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic and magnetic fields of the Earth collapsed, and all life on the planet went into the Great Void, the 3.5 days of absolute blackness described by many ancient cultures in the world. The Emerald Tablets say that whenever we go through a polar shift, we go through a void space as we change our frequencies for about 3.5 days. This is also in the Troano document, depicted by 3.5 stones painted black. This refers to a time when we go through what science calls the electromagnetic null zone. During the pole shift, a phenomenon takes place where everything just seems to disappear for a certain time. Usually it's between 2 to 4 days, and the last time it was 3.5 days. Here's where it gets interesting. What happens to us does not usually happen to a normal species, because most advanced species will have their Merkabas handy at the time of the shift. We didn't, due to our little crisis, and we got sucked into the void space without protection. This resulted in us losing our memories. Science realizes that all of our memories are connected through cells in our brains as well as fields around our heads. What is not entirely understood by science yet, at least not directly, is the connection our memories have with the planet itself. We've discussed this before. The magnetics of the Earth affect how we think and act. The Merkaba is an electromagnetic field that you create around your body that can serve as protection from void as you're consciously going through it. What happened to us when we didn't have that protection? It was a clean wipe. When we existed on Atlantis, we were living at a very high level of consciousness in a higher dimension. We had extremely advanced and sophisticated bodies and minds, and were capable of practically anything, living in a dimension where molecules were spaced so far apart that consciousness could interact with them without physically moving. It's hard to explain because you can literally shape your environment immediately through your consciousness in these higher frequencies. In that sense, we were creators, knowing and understanding oneness, beings of love. But then we fell. We dropped back down to this place called the third dimension. We also fell in consciousness back to zero. We forgot how to use the pineal gland, and it slowly shrunk to the size it is now, like a raisin, where it's supposed to be eyeball size. When this happened, we forgot how to breathe source energy into our bodies, and our lifespans went kaput. Eventually, we went from 900 years to what it is today. We had not experienced this dense reality that we had before, at least for a very long time. We were kind of like a supercomputer that gets completely wiped. No operating system or anything. We had these advanced physical bodies, but we didn't know how to use them. This is why today we are so physically advanced compared to pretty much all the other animals in this third dimension. For a time, the survivors of the Atlantean fall, and there were a few, were literally hairy barbarians. We even had to rediscover fire. The reason we're having such a hard time finding evidence of Atlantis is because for the most part, the events of Atlantis took place on a much higher dimension than our physical Earth exists on right now. Everything I've drawn of Atlantis can't be taken as that's what it looked like, because it didn't. This landmass did physically exist, but the Atlanteans were not inhabiting that dimension of its existence. If the warship hadn't been protected by the Merkaba, the Nacals would have lost their memories. They retained their memories when the Earth came out of the void and began their work once more. Thoth and 1/3 of the Nacals went to the Island of the Sun in Bolivia. Aragot and 1/3 went to Tibet, and Ra and the remaining third went to Egypt, where they waited. Now, we're going to begin bridging the gaps between this story and our current history. In between the fall of Atlantis and the dawn of our first civilizations, who were the Egyptians and the Sumerians, there was a 6,500 year gap between them. What was happening to us in that time? We have to look at this precession chart again. This is where we fell in consciousness, point C, and this was our falling asleep phase too. Thoth, Ra, and the Ascended Masters were waiting until point D. They had to wait for humans to just evolve themselves over a 6,500 year time period until they were advanced enough to actually receive this new information that they were going to provide. Sometime in here was when the flood of Noah occurred. Because of the pole shift, the Earth went through an ice age. This is scientific fact. When the ice melted, it would have caused massive flooding. DNA is the physical manifestation of who you are. It is your soul's physical aspect. What we are seeing in DNA is changes in the codons. There's 64 possible codons in DNA, and humans only have about 22 or so. What we're finding is that there are 6 more codons being activated within these children, and they are choosing 2 of the 6. These kids are what we call indigo and crystal children, and probably the super psychics as well. Now, this is a chromosome. Basically, what this is lots and lots of DNA wrapped into this weird H-like shape. This is located in every cell and is part of your body of consciousness. What Thoth tells us is that every level of consciousness seen here not only has its own consciousness grid, but its chromosome change as well. The second level, where we are now, has 44 and 2 chromosomes. To any scientist, this is basic biology. The first level, however, has 42 and 2, and this third level has 46 and 2. The fourth and fifth have 48 and 2 and 50 and 2 respectively. The primary physically visible difference between these DNA in all life is height. The first level has an average height of 4 to 6 feet tall. The second level, us, has an average height of 5 to 7 feet. Third are about 10 to 16 feet, which we are about to translate to. Fourth is 30 to 35 feet, and the last is 50 to 60. You may remember a being named Metatron, the Hebrew archangel who is the perfection of what humanity is to become. He was 55 feet tall, that guy. The last two heights are far in the distant future for us, though. This is a place in Egypt today called Abu Simbel. The first thing you notice is that these statues are huge, but with the information about the DNA, this paints a different picture. These beings would be in the 60-foot range if they were to stand. They were at the 5th level of consciousness. These beings on a different wall are 35 feet tall, 4th level of consciousness. Here are some third levels as well. Archaeologists saw this and thought that it meant that the man was just much more important than the woman, when in actuality, the kings of Egypt had 5 different names, one for every level of consciousness. Some of the kings were even able to translate into different dimensions, and that's how they guided the population with the power of the gods. In Egypt, according to today's top archaeologists and researchers, the Egyptians and Sumerians both began their civilizations right around the same time from each other, within a few hundred years or so. Both of these civilizations emerged out of nowhere with perfect writing abilities that were not improved upon since. When they first emerged, they were extremely sophisticated and clear, and slowly degenerated over generations. No archaeologist can explain how this happened or explain how it could have happened. They placed Egypt and Sumer into a special classification called stair-step evolution. What happened was, one day, Egypt got its language, full and complete. Then the knowledge leveled off. And then it got another massive leap a little while later. Then suddenly, they knew everything about water and moat systems just perfect. Then, a little time later, bam, they're masters of hydraulics. How did Egypt and Sumer do this? Well, this is what Thoth said. When we were evolving on our own for 6,500 years, Ra and the Ascended Masters were waiting in an underground city beneath the Great Pyramid. We'll come back to this in a bit. Thoth's son Tat formed a group called the Tat Brotherhood, which is a secret group that still exists today as protectors and keepers of the sacred temples. Today, they're still connected to the Ascended Masters. So about 6,000 years ago, some members of the Tat Brotherhood would wait until they would meet someone who could understand what they were going to teach them. When they found someone, they would just tune their frequencies to the 3rd dimension and walk up and tell them information flat out. They said, hey, if you do this and this happens. The Egyptians would say, wow, look at that. Then they would go underground, wait another little while, and repeat the process. Over a short period of time, the Egyptian and Sumerian evolution shot up in stair steps. As for the Sumerians, they also received a more detailed story by those who were assisting them. They described to the Sumerians in all of the details they remembered. They said, this is the history of the planet, write it down. The Sumerians knew about the precession of the equinox because they were told it by the Nacals from Atlantis. After this stair-step period, we began to fall asleep further. Things got worse once more. It was our falling sleep stage of precession, and although the Nacals had given us a boost, we were consciously dozing off. On that note, it's time for the story about the city under the pyramid. Keep an open mind about this because there is very little proof for what I'm about to say. For over 40 years, Drunvalo Melchizedek has been studying human consciousness through sacred geometry and spiritual teachers and masters all over the world. In 1996, he was contacted by a source in Egypt who said that something incredible had been discovered. A stone stele came out of the ground between the paws of the Sphinx into the daylight. They removed it and dug into the earth beneath the Sphinx. There they found a room with 3 tunnels leading off of it. One of the tunnels, which went to the Great Pyramid, had another tunnel coming off it, and it was shielded by a wall of light. Bullets could not pass through this field, and people could not even get close to it without feeling like they're going to die. The Egyptian government found a particular person who could turn off this field. They also had brought in Paramount Studios to film it, as they had filmed the opening of King Tut's tomb. They had a good relationship with Egypt. The government wanted several $1 million from Paramount, but at the last minute they asked for an extra $1.5 million under the table. Paramount was outraged and they backed off. Things were silent for about 3 months. Then Drunvalo heard from a source again who was involved in all this, who said that 3 men shut off the light field and went inside. They found themselves inside a very large building that went on for miles underground, which was really the edge of a giant underground city, which was really just one giant building. Then, a little while later, an Egyptian archaeologist named Larry Hunter began describing the same thing, but more detailed. He said that the city was 6.5 by 8 miles wide and 12 stories deep, and the city was outlined by specific temples in Egypt. The 3 pyramids are lined up with Orion's belt, But there are also small temples for every other star in the constellation. Those temples map out the city underground and are made out of a special stone not found anywhere else in Egypt called Koinen stone. Incredibly enough, very recently, ancient tunnels were found in Romania that led to both Egypt and the inner earth. Now, I don't have time to go into detail about this particular story, but if you want, check out the book Transylvanian Sunrise by Radu Sinamar. To be clear, this is a theory that has not been accepted by the Egyptian government, but the underground city that Thoth said was there is, according to Mr. Hunter, marked by temples made of a unique substance, and the temples match the star pattern of the constellation of Orion. 4,000 years after the stair-step evolution, we were at our lowest stage of our evolution. We were hitting bottom on the awareness road. Suddenly, out of the darkness, 3 men came to Earth to give us a little nudge.